In this video, we'll be looking at patterns of evolution, which are really thinking about some of the large-scale changes that can occur in organisms over time. As always, the PowerPoint is on the subject website, and you can pause the video at any time if you need to double-check anything. We are thinking about an area of the study design that says we need to know about four things: allopatric speciation, convergent evolution, divergent evolution, and extinction. And so we'll look at those four different things. First one we'll look at is the concept of speciation, which you can kind of tell by the name is the process by which new species are formed. So a pretty big and broad term there. And turns out that there might be different types of speciation, so different ways in which speciation can occur. The one we need to know about is called allopatric speciation. And its kind of defining characteristic is that it results from populations becoming geographically isolated, and then because the populations are isolated from one another, differences may accumulate within the populations over time, and eventually they'll become different species. And you may see, or people might try and tell you about sympatric speciation, which is thought to be another type of speciation. But sympatric speciation probably doesn't exist, and more importantly than that, it's not in the study design. We don't need to know about it, so don't worry about it for now. You could worry about it perhaps, in later life. If you want to study sympatric speciation, then I'd recommend you do so, but wait until like November, and then you can worry about that. For now, we'll just look at allopatric speciation. So as I said, defined by the separation of populations. The next four slides look at four different stages of allopatric speciation. I mean, we probably wouldn't, these are not kind of the classic stages of allopatric speciation, it's just one way that we can think about how the process would occur. So we start out with this original parent population of horse-type things, and the population then spreads out. It moves into different surrounding areas, establishing several other populations. But the populations are still connected in this scenario. So the organisms would certainly still be the same species, the different populations, and they'd still be quite similar to one another because of a large amount of gene flow between the populations. But then something happens. Some geographical isolating mechanism occurs, and we've got a few examples of it here. So there's a river suddenly appears and cuts off one population, or a mountain range suddenly bursts up out of the ground and isolates the other population from the group. There are physical barriers which prevent, and the key here being preventing gene flow between the populations. And already that should be triggering something, because you should have an idea that gene flow keeps populations similar to one another. You cut off gene flow, you've got the potential for the populations to grow different to one another over time. And geographical isolation could happen for all kinds of different reasons: continental drift, pulling land masses apart, climate change, which changes the sea levels, have been significant examples in the past. So it's not enough though for the populations just to be separate for them to become different, or for them to become different enough that they are different species. We have to have different selective pressures acting on the populations, because we know that's the big driver of evolutionary change in populations. So in the scenario here, the different populations are now subject to different types of selective pressures. Therefore, we're going to have changes in the allele frequencies between the different populations. And so it's suggesting here that over time, allele frequencies are changing, and we might at this point consider the populations to have become subspecies, meaning they're on their way to being different species, but they're still not reproductively isolated, which is another important term which is noted on here. The concept of reproductive isolation suggesting that the organisms can no longer interbreed to produce viable fertile offspring. So therefore they are still members of the same species. But I guess the last factor of allopatric speciation is giving it enough time. If you give these different populations enough time and different selective pressures, then the differences will start to accumulate. And you have enough accumulation of differences. you have enough accumulation of differences in the population, then eventually you're going to achieve reproductive isolation. So at that point, the different populations could no longer mate together to produce viable fertile offspring, and so they would be said to be different species at that point. And even if the populations combined back together, they would not be able to reproduce. So voila, we have different species. There we go. I've kind of put on this slide just a dot point of those 4 different things. It's not the most attractive slide, but it gives you an idea of some of the things that you might include in answers. Remember, when you're answering questions about allopatric speciation, it's using the context of the question and it's referring to the points that are being asked about. So, for example, some questions may not require you to talk about the separate populations forming. That might already be established in the question, and so you could move on from there. And it might tell you that they're already isolated, and so therefore you'd only need to talk about different selective pressures acting on the populations, changing allele frequencies, meaning over time differences accumulate and they become reproductively isolated. So always consider the context of the question as to what details you're going to include in your answer. There's another diagram of allopatric speciation. Maybe if you just like vertically arranged diagrams. Otherwise, disregard. So we had allopatric, now we need to consider divergent and convergent evolution, and there's some nice diagrams of the two, and if you've got a bit of nous, you might be able to work out just from the diagrams what the dealio is with these 2 different types of evolution. But we'll start off with divergent evolution. So we've got different species evolving from a common ancestral species, and they evolve in different directions, hence the word divergent. And by different directions, we mean they evolve probably quite different features, significant phenotypic differences. And we've got the example here of the ancestral mammal. There would have been potentially just one original mammal species, and it might have looked like this weird little rat thing. And over time, mammal populations spread out, and then they diverged and evolved a whole range of different features to suit the particular niches that they were occupying. So a long neck in a giraffe, a hard outer coating in the armadillo. We could think about whales and dolphins evolving different features. We could think about bats in the sky. They all came from the ancestral mammal, and that mammal then mammals kind of spread out, diverged to occupy their niches. Said in the slide before as well, was important to note that these organisms then exhibit homologous structures. They've got that similarity still in, for example, the forelimb. Their forelimbs all look the same because they've got a recent common ancestor, but the outer covering now looks different because they've evolved to occupy niches. The last point on there is just thinking about an example of divergent evolution when it involves a massive number of species diverging from one ancestral organism. We might call it adaptive radiation, and mammals are the classic example of adaptive radiation. But not too worried about that term. Divergent evolution is the main one to think about. And then the opposite of that, kind of like the opposite of that, is convergent evolution. So in convergent evolution, the classic example here is thinking about different swimming organisms. These organisms all have similar features to one another. So the opposite of divergent, now they've got similar features to one another. However, they have all evolved separately. So the ancestor of the dolphin, that ancestral mammal, wasn't a swimming organism. It didn't have those features. The ancestor of the penguin couldn't swim in the water. Same for the dinosaur. So all these features have evolved separately, and the organisms have become more similar to one another. They have kind of converged because they're occupying similar niches. And there's just an example there of marsupial mammals in Australia and placental mammals in Australia. We kind of find analogues. They are similar to one another. The wombat and the woodchuck, whatever a woodchuck does, they are both similar to one another, but they have evolved from quite different ancestral organisms. And the last thing that's on here is about extinction, which I reckon you probably already know what extinction is, so there's not too much to cover off here. Extinction obviously is when all members of the species die out. We could think about that for the entire section of the species, or we could just think about it in one specific area. Extinction could apply in different contexts. And I've always found it interesting to think that most species that have ever lived are now extinct. And people say that up to 98 or 99% of all species that have lived on this planet have now gone extinct. And we are just looking at one small snapshot of organisms existing on this planet. But perhaps come back in 1 million years, the makeup of the planet will be quite different. Many of the current species will be extinct, but there will be new species that have evolved to occupy their niche and to fill their place. I've got some examples on here which you can look through, that of the Australian megafauna, because I reckon they're well cool. Here's an example of the megafauna sites that we find in Australia. Megafauna, by the way, are, well, the word mega meaning big. These are large organisms that occupied Australia up until 30,000, 40,000 years ago, and then went extinct. Lots of debate as to why they might have gone extinct, but we find plenty of fossil sites with their remains. And they are impressive. Like, we've got this thing, this is, I think, the marsupial lion, was a large carnivore that has now gone extinct. We've got the thylacine that we know about. We finished those off, of course, in Tasmania. And enormous goannas, the size of crocodiles. Just goannas are scary enough as they are. If you meet a goanna out in the forest, like, it'll freak you out. And that one's huge. Crocodiles are pretty bad. But it says that they grew up to 5 minutes. Well, actually, we still got big crocodiles. Nothing's changed. Don't have tortoises that big though. That's just ridiculous. And whatever that thing is, it's big. And the diprotodon is like enormous. We don't have those anymore. They're all gone. They're all extinct. That thing's extinct. Wombats aren't that big anymore. It's extinct. Kangaroos are that big. We still got big kangaroos. And we don't really have to worry about these last slides. They're just in there for your reading interest. It says here, interestingly, it says on average, it's like the average amount of time that species live for before they go extinct, which is kind of weird because it says mammals on average last for about 1 to 2 million years. So if you look back through the history of Earth and the history of the mammals in the fossil record, they tend to only last 1 to 2 million years and then they're extinct. Which makes you think about humans. Modern humans maybe have been around for about 200,000 years. So we still got a fair bit of time to go. We'll be all right. Unless, of course, there's a mass extinction, and mass extinctions are when there's a massive increase in the extinction rate for some particular reason. Generally, it's going to be, and we've seen lots of them throughout history, and we've talked about some of these already, like the Permian extinction and whatnot, killing off a large proportion of the Earth's organisms. You don't need to remember any of these, so don't stress about it. And they might be caused, or they have been caused, by things like volcanic eruptions, which have spewed ash cloud across the Earth, or asteroid impacts. I like how it says down the bottom here that this asteroid impact is an artist's impression, that is not a real photo of an asteroid impacting Earth, so don't freak out. All right, I think that's it. That is it. Enjoy. Finish off your assigned questions and whatnot, and I'll see you all next time I see you.